Chapter 1. The Silent Suffering. The planet of Viridian, 6 was a desolate and unforgiving world, its skies painted in deep crimson and its surface marred by endless expanses of jagged mountains and toxic plains. The air was thick with pollutants, a permanent haze that made the sun appear as little more than a dim, distant ember in the sky. Viridian, 6 was a mining colony, one of the many planets in the galaxy exploited for its resources by the Viridian Corporation, a powerful megacorporation that controlled entire sectors with an iron fist. The people who lived and worked on Viridian, 6 were not citizens of any one world. They were drifters, displaced and desperate, each of them a cog in the endless machinery of intergalactic industry. They came from different planets, different races, and different histories, but they shared one thing in common. They were expendable. Every day, hundreds of alien workers, humans, and hybrids toiled away in the vast underground mines, digging for precious metals and minerals that would fuel the machines of galactic power. The work was grueling, unrelenting, and deadly. The mines themselves were labyrinths of narrow tunnels and unstable walls, and the air was laced with dangerous fumes that made even the toughest workers cough up blood after a few hours of labor. The corporation, which owned every aspect of life on Viridian, 6, provided no safety protocols, no real protection for the workers. In the eyes of the corporation, these lives were worthless, mere commodities to be used and discarded once their usefulness had expired. The alien workers, especially the non-human ones, suffered the most. They were often treated as subhuman, subjected to physical and emotional abuse by the corporation's foremen, who were all too eager to remind them of their position in the galaxy's social hierarchy. To the foreman, these workers were little more than animals, sentient, yes, but hardly deserving of dignity or respect. They were forced to work long shifts with little rest, and the few moments of respite they were given were filled with whispers of escape, of rebellion, of dreams of a life far from the relentless oppression that had come to define their existence. But no matter how loudly they cried, no one came to listen. No one cared. Among the alien species that populated the colony, there was one group that had become particularly vulnerable, an alien species known as the Zaltari. Their race had been nearly wiped out by war centuries ago, and those few survivors had been scattered across the galaxy. The Zaltari were known for their strength and endurance, but they were also fiercely independent and proud. Their society had once been built on principles of honor and unity, but now, under the rule of the Viridian Corporation, their dignity had been crushed beneath the boot of exploitation. The Zaltari were forced to work the deepest and most dangerous parts of the mines, where the risk of cave-ins and gas leaks was ever present. But they endured it because they had no other choice. They had no family left, no home to return to, and no allies in the galaxy to help them. The corporation had done its best to erase the Zaltari from history, treating them as little more than property. They were given no names, no identities, just numbers, stamped into their work uniforms. Their families had been torn apart, their cultures erased, and their lives sold as cheap labor to the highest bidder. Every day, they went down into the mines, their backs bent under the weight of their labor, their spirits crushed by the knowledge that there was no escape, no hope for a better future. The cries of the Zaltari, as they struggled to survive under the harsh conditions, became a constant hum in the background of life on Viridian 6. But these cries were ignored, dismissed as nothing more than the inevitable byproduct of a broken system. No one cared. Among the workers in the mines, there was one human man who had become an anomaly, someone who didn't turn a blind eye to the suffering, someone who refused to accept the status quo. His name was Marcus Riley, a mechanic by trade, and a man who had grown disillusioned with the world he lived in. Marcus had come to Viridian 6 as part of a contract to maintain the mining equipment, simple, technical work that didn't require much thought. But over time, he had come to realize that the people who worked on this planet weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were human, or at least as human as he was, and they were being systematically abused by a system that treated them like cattle. The realization had shaken him to his core, and he had become increasingly aware of the cries that echoed through the mines, the cries of those who suffered in silence. He couldn't ignore them. He couldn't just go on with his work, fixing machines and turning a blind eye to the people who lived in squalor, treated as less than animals. Marcus had seen the abuse firsthand. He had witnessed the foreman use the threat of violence to keep the workers in line, to keep them from even thinking of protesting. He had seen the guards beat the alien workers for the smallest infractions, dropping a tool, missing a quota, asking for a break. The Zaltari were the worst off, their alien appearance and language making them easy targets for discrimination and abuse. But Marcus couldn't stand it anymore. He began to speak out, quietly at first, to his fellow workers, trying to stir up some kind of unity. He spoke of rebellion, of fighting back against the corporation, but his words fell on deaf ears. Most of the workers were too scared, too broken to even think of resisting. Some of them had been here for decades, their spirits long since crushed by the relentless pressure. Still, Marcus persisted. He continued to reach out, to offer hope, to show that there was more to life than being a slave to the corporation. He began to secretly help the Zaltari workers, fixing their broken tools, sneaking them extra rations when he could, doing whatever he could to make their lives just a little bit easier. He knew it wasn't enough, that the system was too powerful, too entrenched, but it was all he could do. It was during one of these clandestine efforts that Marcus encountered a particular Zaltari woman. Her name was Dirya. She was unlike any of the other workers Marcus had met. She was strong, her dark green skin marred by the scars of labor, her face hardened by years of suffering. But there was something in her eyes, a spark of defiance, of hope that made her stand out from the rest. Dirya had been working in the deepest, most dangerous sections of the mines, where the air was thick with toxic gases, and the rock walls were held together only by the barest of safety measures. She had witnessed countless cave-ins and accidents, all of them ignored by the corporation, which saw the workers as expendable. She had lost family members, friends, and even her own hope over the years. But there was something in Marcus that made her pause. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't content to ignore the cries of the suffering. And that was what set him apart. Their first conversation had been tentative, hesitant. Marcus had offered her a hand, a small gesture of solidarity, but she had rejected it at first, unsure of his intentions. It was only after several weeks of working side by side that Dirya began to trust him, to see that he was not just another cog in the machine, but someone who genuinely cared about her people's plight. They began to talk more openly, and slowly, Dirya shared her experiences with him, the pain of watching her people suffer, the endless cycle of exploitation, the crushing weight of a life spent in bondage. As they talked, Marcus realized that there was no easy answer to their problems. The corporation was too powerful, too entrenched in the galaxy's economy for them to just take it down with a few whispered words of rebellion. But he also realized that they couldn't keep living this way. They couldn't just accept the cruelty of the system. Something had to change. He didn't know how to fix it, he didn't even know where to begin. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stand by and watch any longer. He couldn't ignore their cries. The days on Viridian, 6 blended together in a haze of dust, labor, and despair. The constant hum of machinery was like the heartbeat of the planet, its rhythm dictating the lives of the workers who had been forced into servitude by the Viridian Corporation. The alien species, particularly the Zaltari, were the most vulnerable, treated with disdain by the foremen and guards. Their cries, which echoed through the tunnels, had long since become background noise for the corporation's overseers, but they had also become an inescapable presence for those who couldn't ignore them. Jace Riley, a mechanic by trade, had come to Viridian, 6 looking for work, simple jobs maintaining machinery and keeping the mining equipment in operational condition. It was a straightforward existence, one that allowed him to escape the overwhelming loneliness of his past and the struggles of the galactic system's working class. But from the moment he arrived, something felt off. The workers, especially the Zaltari, were clearly broken, their spirits crushed by the conditions they had been subjected to. Every corner of the mining colony reeked of exploitation, and Jace couldn't escape the feeling that something more sinister was at play. He saw it in the eyes of the Zaltari, their tired, hollow eyes that had long lost their spark of hope. Their strength was still apparent in their physique, but it was a strength that had been molded by suffering and forced labor, not by pride or purpose. They were pushed beyond their limits, their very existence a commodity for the corporation's greed. The cries of the workers, especially those of the Zaltari, reverberated through the hallways of the mines, haunting Jace's every step. But, Like the other workers, he had learned to ignore them at first, to block out the noise that filled the air. After all, what could he do? He was just a mechanic, a cog in the system, an expendable part in the machine that kept the entire mining operation running. But as the days passed, he found it harder and harder to ignore the suffering that surrounded him. The way the Zaltari were treated, their grueling shifts, their injuries, their tears that went unnoticed gnawed at his conscience. It wasn't just the physical pain that bothered him. It was the emotional toll that was being exacted on them, the way they had been reduced to mere tools in the eyes of their oppressors. It didn't sit right with him, and the more he saw, the more he began to question his own role in this machine of suffering. Could he, in good conscience, continue to live in this system, benefiting from the labor of those who were being treated as less than human? The answer, for Jace, was becoming clear. No, he couldn't. But what could one person do? What could he do to change this reality, this never-ending cycle of pain and exploitation? As he looked around at the beaten, downtrodden faces of the Zaltari, he knew he couldn't stand by any longer. Chapter 2. The First Act of Defiance. The decision to act didn't come easily. Jace had always believed in doing his job, keeping his head down, and avoiding the kinds of conflicts that could land him in trouble. But the moment he had seen one of the Zaltari workers beaten for the slightest infraction, a tool dropped on the ground by accident, something inside him had snapped. It was a simple thing, a mistake any human worker might have made. But for the Zaltari, it was a sentence, a reason to be punished. The foreman had raised a heavy metal rod, striking the worker with brutal force, and as the worker crumpled to the ground, all Jace could hear were the cries that filled the air, the same cries that had been ignored for so long. That night, Jace lay in his small quarters, the sounds of the workers' wails still echoing in his mind. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't shake the image of the Zaltari worker lying in a heap, blood seeping into the ground, while the rest of the workers continued to toil, without even looking up. That was the way of things on Viridian. 6. People suffered, people died, but life continued on as if nothing had happened. But it was enough. The passivity, the acceptance of the status quo, was something Jace could no longer bear. It was time to act. It was time to do something that could make a difference. The next day, Jace took a risk. Instead of fixing the mining equipment as he was contracted to do, he spent his time moving through the facility, quietly speaking with the workers, asking about their lives and their suffering. At first, they were reluctant to speak to him. They were used to humans ignoring them, to workers turning a blind eye to their pain. But Jace was different. He listened. He heard their stories of oppression, of brutal treatment at the hands of the foreman, of the constant fear they lived under. And he realized something he had suspected all along. They were not beyond help. They were not beyond hope. But they needed someone to stand up for them, someone who could break the chains of silence that had bound them for so long. It was a small act, a simple conversation, but it planted the seeds of something bigger. By the end of the week, Jace had gathered a small group of workers, Zaltari, humans, and a few others who had suffered under the corporation's rule. They were hesitant at first, afraid of what might happen if they were caught. But Jace promised them that there was more to life than this, more to their existence than being slaves to the corporation's greed. "We may be small," Jace said in their secret meeting place, "but we are not powerless. We can take back what is ours. We can start by standing together, showing them that we are not invisible." The words were simple, but they resonated with the group. It wasn't just about taking down the corporation, not yet. It was about standing up, about showing that they were not just cogs in a machine. They were people, and their voices deserved to be heard. But taking the first step wouldn't be easy. Jace knew this. The corporation had eyes everywhere. The workers who rose up would be punished. But the spark of rebellion had been lit. It was only a matter of time before it would spread. That night, Jace made his decision. He would sabotage the mine's main energy grid. It was a simple plan, one that wouldn't hurt anyone directly, but it would be enough to send a message that the workers on Viridian 6 were no longer willing to be ignored. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if it would change anything, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stand by any longer. The next day, while the foreman and guards were distracted by their routine, Jace snuck into the control room of the mine's central power system. His heart pounded as he worked quickly, bypassing security codes and deactivating the system's failsafe mechanisms. With a final click, The entire energy grid went offline, plunging the mines into darkness. For a moment, all was still. Then the alarms blared, a harsh, shrill sound that echoed throughout the complex. The foreman scrambled, yelling orders, trying to figure out what had happened. Jace stepped back, a satisfied grin creeping onto his face. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that this small act of defiance would be the spark that ignited the flame of rebellion. As the miners worked in the dark, the Zaltari whispered their thanks. And for the first time in a long while, Jace felt that what he was doing mattered. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show the corporation that they couldn't just erase their cries anymore. The workers of Viridian 6 would be heard. The dark corridors of the mining facility were eerily quiet now that the power was down. The hum of machinery and the constant buzz of ventilation fans had stopped. The only sounds were the footsteps of workers, now cautiously gathering in small huddles, whispering among themselves. For the first time in years, the workers on Viridian 6, aliens and humans alike, were not moving like mindless automatons. They were stopping, talking, and sharing something they hadn't felt in far too long: hope. Jace moved through the shadows, heart pounding in his chest as he checked his comm device to ensure that the message he had left for Dirya was received. She and a few of the other workers had taken his words to heart and began organizing small groups to spread the message of resistance. No longer were they silent. No longer were they invisible. This small act of defiance deactivating the mining facility's energy grid had set something in motion. And Jace couldn't back down now. But it wasn't just about the sabotage anymore. This was the beginning of something bigger. The workers were waking up, and Jace knew that once they had tasted the power of standing together, there would be no going back. The cries of the oppressed had reached a critical point, and they would no longer be ignored. Still, there was a palpable tension in the air. They had been forced into silence for so long, broken down by years of oppression and fear. But now, Jace could see that the workers were stirring. A fire had been kindled, and while the flames were small, they would grow. He could feel it in the determined looks of the Zaltari, in the quiet resolve of the human workers who had been crushed under the weight of the system for so long. They were ready for change. Jace leaned against the cold metal walls of the facility, taking a moment to breathe and collect his thoughts. The power grid was still down, and the chaos that followed had left the foreman and guards scrambling to regain control. It was in this moment of confusion that Jace made his decision. This wasn't just about a small act of rebellion. He had to keep the momentum going. He had to show the workers that they weren't alone, that they had power not just in their numbers, but in their unity. Time to move, Jace muttered to himself, steeling his nerves. He moved quickly, heading to the nearest communication terminal. This would be his moment to rally the workers, to show them that they didn't need to hide anymore. They could fight back. As he approached the terminal, he saw Dirya standing with a small group of Zaltari workers. They were clearly waiting for him, their faces filled with anticipation. They had seen the power of the shutdown, but Jace knew they needed more. He had to give them the next step, the next action. Dirya, Jace greeted, his voice firm, though he could feel his pulse racing. It's time. We move forward now. Dirya nodded, her purple skin faintly shimmering under the dim emergency lights. What's the plan, Jace? We start with the workers in the lower levels, he said, his voice low but determined. We need to reach them, let them know we're not afraid. The corporation thinks we're nothing but tools. But we're more than that. We have power if we use it together. He turned to the workers who had gathered behind him, their faces set in grim determination. The message he was about to send wouldn't just be for the workers in the mines, it would be for everyone on Viridian 6. They weren't just going to stand by and wait to be exploited any longer. They were going to show the corporation that they were no longer afraid. Jace tapped the comm device, sending a signal through the facility's channels. Attention, all workers, his voice rang out, amplified through the emergency speaker system. This is Jace Riley. The power's down, and for the first time in a long while, we have a chance. They can't control us if we stand together. This is only the beginning. If you're with me, if you're with us, now is the time to act. His words echoed through the facility, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in the hearts of those who heard them. It wasn't much. It wasn't a grand speech. But it was a message of unity, of resistance, of something the workers had been denied for so long. The power to change their own fate. As the last words of his message faded, Jace turned to Dirya. Let's move. We can't waste any more time. They moved quickly, rallying as many workers as they could to the cause. They were already spreading the word, reaching out to the laborers, the miners who had been subjugated for so long. It wasn't a large group, but it didn't need to be. Every step, every word they spoke, was a step toward breaking the chains that had bound them. Chapter 3: The Spark of Rebellion. The response was not immediate, but it was enough. The message Jace had sent through the comm system resonated with the workers in the lower levels, and within hours, word spread like wildfire throughout the facility. Workers began to gather in secret, their conversations quiet but urgent. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. It was no longer just about surviving day to day. It was about their very survival as people, as sentient beings who deserved dignity and respect. By the time the power was restored, the workers were no longer hiding in fear. They were ready. The first wave of workers, mostly human, but with a significant number of Zaltari, stood in defiance, gathered near the main mining shaft. The corporation had sent in guards to restore order, but they were met with resistance instead. The workers didn't back down. "We are not tools," a tall Zaltari woman shouted to the guards, her voice carrying through the dimly lit halls. "We are not your slaves." The guards hesitated, taken aback by the show of defiance. The workers, despite their exhaustion, were standing tall. There was a fire in their eyes now, a fire that had been stoked by Jace's message and by the courage of those who had decided that they could no longer live in the shadows. Jace was at the front of the group, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a protest, it was the beginning of a full-scale rebellion. He could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that there was no turning back. The guards had been trained to deal with unrest, but they had never faced anything like this. They had underestimated the workers for far too long. "Captain Riley," a voice from behind him called out. It was Dirya, her hand on his shoulder. "They're starting to mobilize. The foreman will be on us any moment." Jace nodded, feeling the tension rise in the air. "We need to move. Rally, everyone, get them to the upper levels. If we control the command center, we can shut down their security systems. That'll give us a chance to fight back." Dirya gave him a sharp nod before moving off to organize the others. Jace watched her go, knowing that the real battle was about to begin. This wasn't about fighting for scraps anymore. This was about taking control of their future. As the workers began to move toward the control center, Jace's eyes flicked to the guards who had now begun to draw their weapons. But it wasn't the guards who were his concern. It was what came next, the response from the corporation. If they retaliated, if they brought in reinforcements, it could all be over before it had even begun. But there was no turning back now. The workers were already in motion, pushing forward with a resolve Jace had never seen before. They weren't just fighting for their own lives, they were fighting for each other, for their dignity, for the hope that things could change. As they reached the control center, Jace felt the weight of what was happening sink in. This was it. The rebellion had begun, and whether they succeeded or failed, it would send a message that would echo throughout the entire galaxy. The cries of the oppressed would no longer be ignored. Jace turned to face his people, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We're not backing down," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is our fight, our future. Let's take it." And with that, the first battle in the war for freedom on Viridian 6 began. The workers surged forward, their footsteps steady and purposeful as they moved towards the control center. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the corporation's operations. For the first time, there was a sense of unity, workers, Zaltari, humans, and hybrids standing together in defiance, no longer cowed by the weight of their oppression. Jace walked at the front, his heart pounding, knowing that everything hinged on this moment. Behind him, the workers followed, their faces set with grim determination. They had suffered for far too long, beaten down by the harsh conditions of the mines, silenced by fear and the brutal enforcement of the corporation's rules. But now they had found their voice. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement, a declaration that they would no longer be invisible. As they neared the control center, the first sign of resistance came. A squad of guards emerged from a side corridor, blasters drawn, their faces tense with the threat of violence. But the workers didn't falter. Instead, they squared their shoulders and stood their ground. "Move back," one of the guards shouted, his voice gruff with authority. "This is a restricted area. You have no right to be here." But Jace stepped forward, his eyes meeting the guards. "We have every right," he said, his voice steady. "You've been exploiting us for too long. You don't get to dictate our lives anymore. Stand down." The guard hesitated, his fingers twitching around the grip of his blaster. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a brief moment, the standoff seemed endless. The workers stood firm, their collective defiance growing stronger with each passing second. Jace could see the doubt flicker in the guards' eyes, a sign that they weren't as unified as they once were. The power of the workers' resolve was starting to show. Suddenly, one of the workers, a large, burly Zaltari named Zira, stepped forward. With a single, swift movement, she knocked the guard's blaster from his hand, sending it clattering to the floor. The guard stumbled back, shock and fear in his eyes. The workers cheered, a powerful roar of triumph that echoed through the halls of the control center. The first victory had been won, and the momentum surged forward. But this wasn't over yet. "Get to the control room," Jace shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to shut down their systems before they can call for reinforcements." With that, they rushed past the stunned guards, who were too slow to react. As they reached the doors of the control center, Jace's hand slammed against the security panel. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the room beyond, a large, sterile space filled with rows of consoles and control terminals. At the far end of the room stood the head of security for the corporation, Commander Oren, a cold-eyed man whose reputation for cruelty had spread like wildfire across the sector. He had been the one responsible for enforcing the system of oppression on Viridian 6, and his presence here made it clear that the corporation was preparing to fight back. "You think you can take control of this station?" Oren sneered, his hand hovering near the console in front of him. "You're nothing. The corporation owns you, and you'll never escape its grip." Jace stepped forward, the fire of defiance burning in his chest. "We're done being owned. This is our world now. We won't be controlled by you or anyone else. It's over." The workers behind him nodded, a unified front that sent a wave of power through Jace. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore, they were fighting for everyone who had ever been oppressed, who had ever been silenced. The rebellion had spread too far for anyone to stop now. Oren's eyes narrowed as he turned toward the security terminal, his fingers flying over the keys in a frantic attempt to regain control of the facility. But Jace was already on him, racing across the room and slamming his hand against the console. The system flickered, and the lights in the control center dimmed for a moment. "Enough of this," Jace said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "It's over." He pressed a final sequence of commands, and the entire facility went dark. The control center's security system shut down, and the facility's central power grid was disabled. The workers had won. The corporation's stranglehold on Viridian 6 had been broken, even if only for a moment. But that moment was everything. Jace turned to face Dirya, who had been by his side throughout the entire journey. "We did it," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief and relief. "We actually did it." Dirya nodded, her expression one of fierce pride. "This is just the beginning, Jace. They'll come for us, but we've shown them that we can fight back. We have the power now." Jace smiled grimly, feeling the weight of their victory sink in. "We've only started. But this changes everything." Chapter 4. The Dawn of Change. As the workers began to celebrate, their cries now echoing with victory rather than pain, Jace took a moment to step back and survey the room. The control center was silent now, the hum of machinery replaced by the victorious cheers of the workers. But there was no time for celebration. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Dirya approached him, her eyes filled with determination. "They won't let us have this victory for long, Jace. The corporation will retaliate." Jace nodded, his face set with resolve. "I know, but we've proven something today. We've proven that they can be beaten. We're not going to let them take back control. We've started a revolution, and we can't stop now." The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, a reminder that the corporation was already mobilizing to retake the facility. Reinforcements would be on their way. But Jace was ready. They had the workers' support now, and they had the momentum. It wasn't just about taking down the corporation anymore, it was about changing the system entirely. Jace turned to Dirya, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. We need to send a message to the rest of the galaxy. Viridian 6 is just the beginning. Dirya nodded. We'll make sure everyone knows what's happening here. This rebellion won't stay contained. The whole galaxy will hear our cry for freedom. Jace took a deep breath, his mind racing. The fight ahead would be long, and it would be hard, but they had something the corporation didn't: unity, determination, and a cause that was just. For the first time in years, he felt hope stirring in his chest. They could change this. They could free themselves. As the sirens grew louder, signaling the approach of the corporation's forces, Jace turned back to the workers who had gathered in the control center. Their faces were filled with determination, their eyes bright with the knowledge that they had done something that no one had thought possible. "We've won this battle," Jace shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "But the war isn't over. We'll fight for every single one of us. We'll fight for our freedom, for our dignity. And we'll fight until we're free." The workers roared in agreement, their collective voice rising in a chorus that seemed to shake the very foundations of the facility. This was the beginning of something new, something that couldn't be stopped. Jace looked out toward the horizon of Viridian 6, the red sky now seeming brighter, as if the planet itself had been awakened by the revolt. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: this rebellion was just the beginning of a new dawn. And for the first time, the cries of the oppressed were not only heard, they were answered.